And so welcome once again, everyone. I'm so happy to have all of you join here today. My name is Amy and I use she, her, and I'm happy to have you all joining us today to learn about supporting an individual with hearing loss. Before we dive in, I want to acknowledge that while I am joining virtually, I am coming from the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, the Haudenosaunee, and most recently, the Mississauga of the Credit River, and that this land is covered by Treaty 13. And we're very fortunate to have Lori Jackson joining us today from Canadian Hearing Services. Lori is a social worker who has worked with Canadian Hearing Services for 20 years. Lori has a passion for helping others and is the chair of the Scarborough Networking Group for all services in Scarborough serving seniors for many years. Lori is also a trainer to the crisis prevention, intervention, and de-escalation training techniques for her agency. And as we've already heard, she has an absolute wealth of knowledge that I'm very happy for her to be sharing with us today. And so with that, Lori, I'm happy to hand things over to you.
Okay, perfect. Let me just share my screen. So thank you very much. So we'll be talking today a little bit about hearing loss, aging, and how we do that. Okay, so I'm with the Canadian Hearing Services, or CHS for short, and our vision and mission is really around being a leading organization with deaf and hard of hearing individuals within Canada and advancing a barrier-free society. So essentially what we want to do is try to ensure that we're advocating, helping change policies, procedures throughout Canada to ensure that our services are accessible. And we've been trusted since 1940, so we're celebrating 81 years. But previous to Canadian Hearing Services, we were called Canadian Hearing Society, and we are a not-for-profit agency. And when we have services such as hearing aids and device sales, those proceeds actually go back into programming like mine that service the community. And we're quite unique because what we do is we have a range of services that really help individuals with different programming, and I'll get into a little bit about what that looks like. In terms of different age groups. And we have great, strong partnerships with other national organizations and even manufacturers. So it's not, before COVID, we used to actually meet with actual manufacturers of devices, and we would give them our frontline information about where we would see gaps. So one of the gaps that we often identified were with, say, for carbon monoxide detectors and making them accessible and not as a higher cost to clients. And so these kind of manufacturers actually take that information and go back and try to develop that type of products for our clients. So we are a provincial organization. We have offices throughout Ontario. And right now we are virtual for most of the service that we are performing. And so you can reach any one of us. And we have a variety of different types of services at CHS. The program that I work with is called the Hearing Care Counselling Program, and it's for anyone who is 55 years of age and older and has what we call an acquired hearing loss, meaning that they can usually use hearing aids or some type of device to have communication. We also have a communication devices store. So this is where when individuals are really hard of hearing, they may have difficulty hearing on the telephone or perhaps hearing the fire alarm or the doorbell. And we have day-to-day devices to ensure that independence of the client. We also have a corporate devices section that does things like long-term care, retirement homes, churches, worship centers, school boards to ensure that they're accessible as well. Our current audiology and hearing aid sales are at not all of our locations, but we do have one at Providence Healthcare and downtown Toronto by Casa Loma. And we are seeing people in person in those clinics to do the hearing test and write the prescription of the hearing aids. We also have speech language pathology. Now, this is only in Toronto, and we partner with the City of Toronto. And our speech path is only seeing individuals who are out of school age. So school age would then be the boards. We have mental health counseling, employment services, educational support services, general support services, and we also have interpreting for the deaf and CART. So you may have seen CART. Actually, Zoom is really great for that. It's the closed captioning aspect. And then we also have the digital media. So this is really important as COVID has happened and we evolve onto online formats. When people are using, different types of presentations like this, or giving other presentations, that those media, even after they've been done and then posted can be captioned, so then it's accessible for anyone. So when we look at some of the causes of hearing loss, it could be medications, it could be some type of hit to the head or a car accident, it could be genetics or disease, it could be noise exposure. We talked a little bit about that. It could be, and noise could be from construction, war, different types of louder environments like manufacturing, diabetics. So we often will say that we always worry about anyone who has diabetes looking at their eyesight, but the ear is an organ as well, and it can be affected by diabetes. And then we have the aging process, which I'll talk a little bit more about, and that is a high frequency hearing loss. So this is where conversational speech as we age can generally and very slowly start to affect where we can hear some people speaking, but maybe not others. And this is called presbycusis. So how do we know if we have a hearing loss? And this can happen when a person often will speak too loudly or too softly. And this is because they can't monitor how loud or how soft their actual voice is. They could have their radio or their television on too loud. And often what happens is they will give inappropriate responses to questions. So, are you attending today's presentation? And they may respond with, no, I've already been shopping. So sometimes to the person who is receiving that message, it could seem like it's confusion or some type of cognition issue. They often will favor one ear, so they have one ear that's hearing better than the other. And they may have difficulty hearing if someone is at the door, hearing on the telephone, or hearing in a noisy environment. As the noise in the environment becomes louder, it could be harder for them to hear the individual who's speaking with them. And often what people will say is that they can hear someone is actually speaking, but they can't make out the words that they're saying. So it sounds as though the individual is mumbling. When we think about hearing loss stressors for people with the hearing loss themselves, communication, especially in louder environments, can be very difficult. Poor lighting when you're not seeing someone's face, or you're not able to see the speaker, or someone has their hands in front of their mouth, can be more challenging. The other thing that's important to know for people who are speaking with someone who is hard of hearing is that when you have a hearing loss, it takes a lot of concentration for the person to pay attention. So they're very focused on the person, they're looking for the cues of changing subjects, and that can actually be exhausting and fatiguing for that individual. And the visual part as well is really paying attention because they're looking for all of those cues. They're trying to see your expression, and they're also trying to often read your lips. So we think about, when we consider those things, we think about what is the impact to communication itself. So it can be social, it can be psychological, it can also be physical. So especially when somebody was mentioning about getting hearing aids, some people don't wear hearing aids because they sometimes feel overwhelmed, and they may feel like they get fatigued or get a headache, especially in the beginning when they're not used to wearing them. And sometimes we don't really recognize all of these stressors because we don't really think about how communication and trying to pay attention and listen can actually drain us. So some people will say, I get a headache every time I go, and especially when we were in person before, when I get into these environments, or I feel this anxiety. And a lot of times it has to do with the worry about how am I going to communicate or how well I'm going to hear. So when we think about hearing loss itself, this is an audiogram. So on the top, it says low tones to high tones. So it says 125, then it goes to 4,000, 8,000. So if we think about a piano, it goes from the low tones to the high tones. And then on the side where it says soft sounds to loud sounds, that's the amount of volume that has to be put up. So when we think about when you've had a hearing test, or if you haven't, they'll ask you, do you hear this sound? And you will raise your hand and it will be at a certain volume level. That's where we want to see, where are we hearing those pitches and tones and how loud are we hearing them? So when we think about normal hearing is between -10 and 25 decibels, which is how loud the volume needs to be. So as we age, usually those low tones will actually stay fairly intact. They'll be at the normal level or just at the cusp of mild. And then as we the conversational speech where it gets to 1,000 to 8,000 will start to drop off. And this is why sometimes for the individual who has the hearing loss, it can be difficult to recognize, because if they're in a quiet environment or even something like this on Zoom, They can hear the individual if they speak very clearly and they're rather at a normal pace, so it's kind of slow down, and if they have a clear voice. Sometimes men are easier to hear as well. So some individuals are very clear, and often people will say that I have a very good voice. And then they'll hear someone who has a higher, softer voice, and they'll say, oh, but that person doesn't hear as well, or doesn't speak well, or I can't hear that person because she mumbles. Well, often it will be where their voice falls. So the other part of the test, which is most important, so you'll have this part where we'll check the tones and how much volume you'll hear. And this is exactly how a hearing aid is set and customized to your hearing loss. And what it will do is it'll bump you up into those normal ranges and make some of the ones, so 125 and 250, if that was a little bit low in the mild section, they will bump you up into the normal range. The second part of the test is really the most important part of the test, and it's called the word recognition score. And the word recognition score is really seeing how well does your brain and your ear take the message, translate it, and send the message to the brain. And what they will do is they will ask you words like hot dog, baseball, ice cream, and they'll ask you to repeat them. And what we're looking for is how well does your brain process those sounds? This is most important because hearing aids cannot help with that. You receive a score out of 100. And so say, for example, if someone was receiving 80%, that is in a soundproof booth where we really want to make sure you have a headset on. There is no background noise. There are no visual or auditory distractions. That really essentially means in that conversation, we're missing 20% of words. So this is where our program really comes in. We look at the hearing test and we say, okay, here, even with hearing aids, you're still going to have to manage conversation in a different way. So what we often will say to individuals is that if you're speaking with someone and they didn't understand what you said, instead of saying, pardon me, or repeating what you said, you want to say it in a different way, because some of that word recognition, no matter how many times you repeat it, will still not be able to hear.
And I just want to add that this is something contrary to what is often recommended if someone is living with cognitive impairment, where it can be helpful to repeat it in the same words that you used prior, because then they don't have to reprocess a new sentence. So I always find that point very interesting.
Yes. And we also, just to note, and I think I do have a slide on cognition and hearing loss. They really go hand in hand. I work a lot with the Alzheimer's Society of Toronto. And we've done a lot of videos before when they had funding. It's just how parallel they are. So a lot of times what happens is that when people are taking those mini mental health tests to see whether or not there's any cognition or any dementia present, sometimes if they're not tested for hearing or they don't have an amplification when doing it, the results can actually be skewed. So we actually have clients that come to us who are diagnosed at a later stage of dementia, but when we aid them, they may have some cognition loss, but it's not as significant as it was presenting before they having hearing aids. So when we look at hearing loss and who's it affecting, when we think about aging population, presbycusis, or that high frequency loss, is generally what's affecting most of that population, and it happens quite gradually. So sometimes it can be a little bit more difficult, as I mentioned, to actually identify. So here's an audiogram. So when I was saying about how those lower pitch tones kind of stay in that normal range and then they drop off. And often what's affected is conversational speech, and vowels and traffic and footsteps actually stay intact. So this is where sometimes it can be confusing for the person with the hearing loss. What they can't hear is consonant sounds and whispering or soft sounds. So they don't hear things like the S, the CH, the TH words. So those are the ones that are a bit more challenging. And this is where they can often hear someone speaking, but they can't really decipher what the words are. So that's where the mumbling comes in. And when we think about numbers and dates, there's a lot of TH sounds. And so when we think about clients who have hearing loss and they're trying to manage something over the phone, especially during COVID, where a lot of appointments and times are happening over the phone, we'll ask clients to then confirm. So if you said it was today at 1, I might have said, okay, are you saying it's Monday or Tuesday at 1 o'clock? And then they can confirm yes or no to ensure that we have that ability. And when we think about that mini mental health test, when they do a quarter after or 11, that can be difficult for individuals to hear who have a hearing loss. So sometimes it can present, it was the hearing loss that they didn't understand, and then they're nervous, obviously, because they know why they're at the assessment. But they may misinterpret what was being asked. So when we think about perfect hearing, so when you can hear normally, everything is really black and white. When you start to have some hearing loss, you can often make out what's being said and by guessing and knowing cues, and this can be helpful, but hearing aids will help, but they'll never restore normal hearing to where it was. And so there's always, technology is wonderful and advancing, but it will never restore normal hearing and make it perfect again. So when people talk about background noise, that actually, even with the background noise blockers on hearing aids, it will never be 100%. And then when we're not aiding anybody, they're not really hearing much. So when we think about, as we evolve with COVID and over the phone is happening more frequently, especially with, instead of visiting, like sometimes I don't visit some of my cousins who are older because I have kids that are in school. I don't want to bring anything to them just in case. And even with my clients. So when we call someone, we want to make sure that there is no background noise, so that if they had a television or a radio on, we wait and ask them to turn that off. We also want to encourage people to use hearing aids. I have a picture here of how hearing aids are used with a telephone. So when we have a hearing aid that goes behind the ear, the microphone is actually behind the ear. So we want to put the receiver to that microphone. So we normally always put it to our ear. So when you wear hearing aids, it takes some time to get used to putting that receiver to the hearing aid itself. We want to try to speak as clear as possible. So doesn't necessarily, when we say slow down, people exaggerate that slow down. When we try to speak as clear as possible, it really forces us to slow down, but in a more natural way. And we want to give cues for people who are really struggling with hearing over the phone is when we change topics. You might want to say, oh, and I wanted to ask you about, and then that way they know that there's a transition of subject. And we go back to that rephrasing of information and making sure that we're kind of asking things in a different way. And we also want, so for us, like as a worker, I might say to someone, I give them important information. I may ask them to repeat what they heard back just to make sure that they heard. Your appointment will be on this date, and then that way they can repeat it back and I know that they heard it. Worst case scenario is spelling the word out if you had to, or counting. So I've counted, and then that's helped someone as well. And when we can, we really try to use this format using Skype, FaceTime, Zoom, or any other platforms that someone can see your face, because it gives all those cues together, as well as the expression. Worst case scenario with individuals with a severe loss, we've been writing them letters. And then that way, or if they have the ability to have a phone, is texting, because then it's not, the information doesn't get skewed. If they have hearing aids and they have the ability when you call them, is using a speakerphone. So the speakerphone will mimic conversation a little bit better in the same way as you being present. And if they have two hearing aids, and the sounds will come through both hearing aids. So sometimes that gives like another option and a benefit to the client themselves. So we think about hearing aids and masks, so something we never had to think about, but most hearing aids now are going behind the ear. And the biggest concern that we've seen is that people are putting their hearing aids, have their hearing aids on, and then they'll put the mask closest to their head. So the elastic is beside the head and the hearing aid is out, with the thought that at least the hearing aid is out collecting sound. But what's happened is you forget that you have the hearing aids on, you go to take your mask off, and the hearing aids are flying off and either falling on the ground or breaking or being lost. So always making sure that the hearing aid is against the head, and then the elastic is there. The other option is in the bottom picture is what we call oda clips that can be attached to a hearing aid. So we also do this for individuals with dementia, and it's a little clip, looks like an eyeglass, but you put it on the back. So if someone's at risk of playing with the hearing aid and they take it out, it falls behind them, so that it's a safety issue too, that they can't put it in their mouth. But with the mask now, you can go to the dollar store and buy the little eyeglass holders, and then you can put them on your hearing aid. So if it did come off, it would, at least you would have it still attached to the other hearing aid.
I also, if I can ask just a question about the
Sure.
masks, I love having the little leashes. But also, you mentioned at the beginning just sort of the importance of visual cues and reading lips. Um, Obviously, masks really block a lot of that. Have there been any suggestions, either using clear masks or trying to use avenues where you don't have to wear a mask, like Zoom, as you've mentioned?
Yes, so we do actually, CHS is selling clear masks through Hue Masks, which recently just came out with, so they originally were a level 2. So in terms of clinical setting, we were not allowed to use them. The audiologists were not allowed to use them. Now they come out with a level 3, which are, the higher standard. And they are very helpful because then you can see the person's face. So I know that some of my clients' family members have been purchasing them to help with communication, because when they go into a retirement home or a nursing home, they're required to wear a mask, obviously. And so this has given them that little bit of boost, especially if there's dementia present, that they can see that people are not angry, because it's really hard to tell expressions. And if someone is confused or worried or scared, and then you come with a mask, it's hard to really make that friendly face. So the masks are helpful. I think I have a picture of one coming up. The other issue that we've had that's come forward is really those glass barriers. So how do we communicate through those glass barriers with the mask? So there's a whole bunch of different ways. And so we've been really outreaching to a number of different organizations, the banks, and just, what else can we do? So there's a few things. So there's the pocket talker here. And I know a few of the nursing homes now are using them, and you can use them with the cord. So there's an extension cord, and you can take the microphone cover off. That way you can clean it, but it gives that distance of 10 feet. It goes up to 10 feet. So you have your distance of 6 or 7, and then they wear a headset. And then that way you can talk into the microphone. And they've been using it for even with people with hearing aids. So they take the hearing aids out, they use this headset, because when they have to distance and then there's another barrier in front, it can make it quite difficult. So this has been something that's worked out quite well. So what do we try to do? So originally, before COVID, we would always make sure we had someone's attention when we were speaking to them. And so that's just even as important in today's environment, trying to face them and then trying to speak as clearly. And if we know we're getting excited, to try to slow that down and remember in the back of our minds, we need to be speaking as slowly as possible. So when we think about when people purchase hearing aids, a couple things to know is through OHIP, there's the Assistive Devices Program. Some people may already know about it, ADP. They fund other things like glasses and walkers and things of that nature. And ADP funds $500 per hearing aid every 5 years. And that started in 2011, where now there's a little bit of rules around that. It's usually the exact date. So if it was today, you could not get funding until 5 years to the exact date. If your hearing aid breaks, or maybe your hearing loss has declined significantly, that those hearing aids are no longer compatible with your hearing loss, you would have to go back to the clinic and have proof. And then they would send that proof off to ADP for funding or a reevaluation. And it's becoming a little bit more challenging to be able to do that. So when we think about hearing aids in general, it's just looking at how to troubleshoot them. And so one thing to know about hearing aids is that as they start to look like the bottom picture on the right, that a little behind the hearing aid that has a little dome, these tend to be the most popular now. Those batteries are only really lasting about 5 to 8 days. So what we really encourage families and clients using hearing aids to do is that when you take the sticker off the back of a hearing aid, is to put it on the calendar for today. And then you will say, okay, in about 5 days, is my hearing aid still working well? Is it beeping at me to change the batteries? And then you have an idea of how long your batteries will last. And if you have any support people coming in to help you change the batteries, or there are multiple people, then they have an idea how frequently that hearing aid battery may need to be changed. Cleaning the hearing aid often is best to do it at the end of the day, or depending on the wax. So if they have really sticky wax, sometimes it's better to do it in the morning so it has a little bit of time to dry. You want to wipe the hearing aid off even with the Kleenex, and you can use a brush. So most hearing aids will come with a little kit. The little tiny brush that it comes with
provide home care services for patients.
Is super small. And what you can do is just go to the dollar store and buy yourself a toothbrush. And then that way you can have a little bit more control, and the bristles are a little bit larger to kind of wipe that away. Wax guards are something that are often put in hearing aids. So this is the middle picture with that little white picture is, that's a wax guard. So if you think about it, like in a sink where you have the guard in there, that is really to prevent any of the wax from getting in. So it will come with a quick kit to change it. And now how often to change it really depends on what kind of wax somebody has. Some people produce a lot of wax where they have to go have it removed from the doctor. Other people have never had that happen. So it really depends on how dirty that actually gets. When it starts to look like that picture, we want to take it out and replace it, because when it's blocking, then the sound is not getting through to the ear. Those little domes on the far right hand side, the little black one, a lot of people love these hearing aids because the customized mold ones, actually when you put your hands up to your ears, you can hear yourself breathing, talking, and chewing, and a lot of people don't like that. And the ones that they have now with the little dome prevent that. And so they tend to be a little bit more, people are more satisfied with that type of hearing aid. So people who don't want to wear hearing aids often go to these kind of personal amplification options. We don't really recommend this as opposed to hearing aids, only because it's not specified. So when we think about the piano and how much you can hear, a hearing aid is a customized product because you may not need amplification in certain ranges. What this does, what these amplifiers do, is they amplify everything. And they also will amplify background noise. So they're good for certain scenarios. So we use them for assessments. We encourage other social workers and anybody in the community doing assessments to use them. Hospitals have them. And sometimes we'll recommend them for families. So usually we don't recommend them unless a client is maybe homebound, bedbound, in a nursing home and not well, and the hearing aids are no longer an option for various reasons. So this is when we would recommend this. And we go to that, what Amy and I were talking about, just that hearing loss and cognition. And we know that individuals who are aided, who are not aided rather, will have a rapid cognitive decline. So it will increase the cognition decline. And we also know that it's really when people are doing assessments in the community, and we do a lot of outreach to physicians and social workers and hospitals and the Central East Lynn, those care coordinators, is that if they're not doing an assessment with an amplified device, then you're not really necessarily getting an accurate reading of what is going on. And some of our clients, by the time they get to us, they may have some cognition, they may have other health ailments, and now they're reaching out for help because they were able to be independent before and something has happened. So when we're using those amplification, it helps us to kind of tease out what's happening. And we would never go in and do it an assessment with someone of another language without an interpreter. So it's kind of the same idea as using that amplification to help us. And often when we've used those amplification, when we're doing an assessment with the client who might be resistant to using hearing aids, they all of a sudden see that smoothness of conversation. Oh, wow, I didn't have to, they feel a little bit better, and they realize how much the amplification can assist them. And when we have clients with hearing aids, they may not always be working. So there's a lot of assumption just because the person has the hearing aids that they're working in their good working order and they match the hearing loss. So just like eyeglasses, it could change where they may need to be adjusted. And a lot of times hard of hearing and deafened clients might not be able to comprehend that many mental health tests. We talked a little bit about that if anybody is going to go for any of those tests, we really want to look at how well that they're hearing. And sometimes that hearing loss can really make someone withdraw. So that was one of the reasons our program actually started about 30 years ago, was this isolation of older adults that would stop participating because they couldn't hear and they didn't know what to do. So sometimes that could be looked at as behavioral issues, because some people can get aggressive and angry. So just depending on personality can look different depending on what that might look like. So one of the things that comes up often in our presentations is tinnitus and hyperacusis. So tinnitus or tinnitus is that ringing or buzzing or noise in the ear. And there's a lot of different reasons why this happens. But when we look at some of the reasons about managing it, we want to look at what caffeine intake is, if someone is smoking, salt can make it a little bit worse, stress will make it worse. And often what we'll say is that when the room becomes quiet is when that tinnitus will start to amplify. Bedtime is always kind of having some type of white noise or a radio or even the television on a little bit, a fan, something for your brain to focus on. And hyperacusis sometimes comes up, but this is where people are sensitive to sound, where everything seems really loud. And what sometimes we see is that clients start wearing earplugs, and this is the worst thing to do because then you become more hyper aware of that sound. So we really want to introduce people slowly to sound and making noise in the environment. And we can do that in a controlled way, especially if they're at home, is just, again, keeping a radio on and maybe turning the volume up or the television so you can see where that is. And when we think about people in long-term care, the Ontario Long-Term Care Act in Section 37 has something called personal items and personal aids. And we advocated for a very long time, and I'm very proud of my coworker Sandra Wooderick and I, we helped get that hearing aid label into there. So it is the responsibility of long-term care to be putting hearing aids in. They should also, if it's been replaced or a new hearing aid comes in, be labeled. And they are also required to help people maintain that hearing aid. Often they don't have the capacity to do it, or they don't have the staffing, or there's different messages that are coming through depending on the home. And understandably, a lot of the workers are worried that if they break the hearing aid, they'd be responsible, but it is their responsibility to maintain them and be putting them in and taking them out and changing the batteries and cleaning them. So what do I do? So we perform right now phone assessments. We do these kind of assessments if necessary, consultations. So some people will go and they'll have a hearing test and they'll not be sure about outcomes or the questions they can ask or cost or, what are my rights? When can I take it back? How do I use it? And we can give some information about that. We'll also counsel clients on the grief of losing hearing loss, because it can be really frustrating when we can't communicate and we may not know the questions to ask or how to use communication. So we'll look at the hearing test. We go back to how much hearing loss someone might have, how much word recognition they may have, and we'll teach them, how do I ask for clarification, and give them some realistic expectations. My hearing aid may work really, really well, but I might have a significant hearing loss that also presents other issues. So what's a realistic expectation? So some people will say, I know my neighbor received a hearing aid and they paid a lot of money and it's working fantastic. And my other neighbor got a hearing aid and it doesn't work at all. And I'll always say, what does the hearing loss look like? So we need to look at the hearing loss first to see what is compatible, because it's not always the hearing aid's fault. And then we look at the process of getting a hearing aid, what you can expect, and we give examples. So some people will call me and say, I'm not ready to get a hearing aid yet, but I need a device for the telephone and I need a device for the TV. And I will always it's always best to have your hearing test evaluated and then look at getting hearing aids, because when you start to buy devices for multiple items and to make you independent or help you be independent, it can be costly, and really they pigeonhole you just a phone, right? And phones can be expensive for hearing loss itself. And we really want to make sure that our goal is always to keep you independent and safe at home and being able to participate in whatever activity that it is that you enjoy, whatever your lifestyle might hold. So, my first question is always when someone has a hearing loss, can you hear the fire alarm? Can you hear the door? Can you make a call to 911 and make sure that people are safe? And we also have educational sessions like this. We do support groups, and we also do what's called the hearing help classes. So we do a series of 4 or 5 sessions where we talk about, really analyzing hearing a test. What are your options? And we can do that over the phone and virtually. And our program is actually free. And we are funded through the LIN Ontario Health. And now, what is the long word? They don't even have an acronym. Community Support Services Central East. I'm going to get that wrong. We also have funding through the City of Toronto and United Way. We also do a lot of fundraising. As you can imagine, fundraising in the last during COVID has gone down significantly. And I talked a little bit about the for-profit part. So that product sales and any of the services that we have come back into programs like mine. And we do offer different languages. So we have English, Cantonese, Mandarin, Portuguese, Russian, and French. And because we are virtual, we can service them no matter where anybody lives at this time. And some of the devices for the home, I always like to show pictures. So the top left side is a little headset with the red, and that is for a television. And so you wear the headset and there's a little dial that allows you to turn up the volume, and it's cordless. So you could walk around and be able to hear the television. The one in the middle, the black one with a little round disc and looks like a little doorbell. It's a silent doorbell. When you press the doorbell, that device actually connects to a table lamp and will flash and let you know what's happening, and little icons will open up. And that little disc is called a bed shaker. So it shakes you awake. So this is really great for people who can't hear the door. Maybe they're not hearing the phone, or perhaps maybe they're having other people come in and help them, like a PSW, and we don't want people to leave their doors unlocked. Our phones are always for amplification. So there's two components to our phones, is that there'll always be a volume and a tone control. So we go back to that where I was saying most older adults will have a high frequency hearing loss. These phones can then be pushed to the lower tone to kind of help amplify. The other thing we often will say for people who are struggling on the phone is getting caller ID. So often we get a lot of people who call, but if you had caller ID, sometimes that really helps people know, oh, it's Lori calling me, and I know she's going to be calling me about A, B, and C. So it helps you guide without trying to figure out who's on the phone. The middle one that says fire is one of the ones we advocated for as frontline workers, is that this device is for hearing the fire alarm. And so it has to be a newer fire alarm that has what they call a T3. So it's a 3 beep. It picks up the sound of that 3 beep. And that little disc, again, is the bed shaker that goes under your pillow, will start to shake when it hears the fire alarm, and it will flash and it will say fire. And then that will wake an individual up. And the other one was that pocket talker I was talking about, that amplification. The other one is we often see a lot of people who have individuals in their home with cognition. So they may have dementia, they may be at risk of wandering. And we have different devices to help wake those people up. So there's a contact for the door, and there's a pager. So it will send the little message to the pager and vibrate instead of making an alarm. And it will let someone know if someone's leaving. There's also a mat. So we've used the mat in different environments. So for example, if someone is if there's two people, like partners, and one partner gets up in the middle of the night and they step on the mat, it will wake the other individual up to let them know that that person is waking up. Or you can we put it beside people worried about falls. So we put it in the bathroom. Sometimes they were worried about the stove. So we put it in front of the stove. So as soon as that person steps on it, they get an alert. So it's been very helpful in that way. There's a lot of different ways to set them up. And that's it.
I also just want to say thank you so much for all of that. I'm going to stop the recording now.